One of the things that I think has probably reduced the number of business closures that we've seen is the Paycheck Protection Plan, which has actually allowed small businesses to get access to loans to help them maintain their businesses and employment. Now, this has certainly helped. And so we haven't seen the same number of closures that we probably would have seen in its absence. But I think one of the things that is perhaps worrisome here is, what happens when PPP ends? If you look at the, kind of the far right figure, the circle graph there, in the notes below that, it's talking about the proportion of businesses that are actually worried about having to close permanently. And 58% of small business owners said that they were worried about having to close permanently in the near future. Just to kind of, it's hard to kind of think about what that stat means, but imagine walking down your local downtown and having every other storefront, whether it's a shop or a restaurant, be empty.
One of the things to recognize is that the way we distributed PPP had big effects on who got access and who didn't. The fact that we went through the banks, the fact that for the banks, it was easiest to effectively distribute this money to companies with which they had pre-existing relationships where they sort of understood what they were dealing with. And the fact that, I think there are probably more minority-owned businesses that, just sort of lacked that pre-existing relationship banking with the banks that had, the most PPP money to distribute. And that's part of what we're seeing playing out. And until there were some structural changes in the PPP, that's sort of how it was playing out in the field. But I think that means that we have to start thinking about, what does, how do these funds, whether it's, another injection of capital similar to the PPP, or how we think about SBA backed loans and so forth, how do we distribute this and what can we be doing in terms of design of the mechanisms to make sure that we are actually being intentional about things and that we are being fair about things. And I think there's a little too often we sort of just point at the infrastructure that we have and say, we'll just use this and, ignore the fact that a lot of what has been, built up, not necessarily intentionally over time, but just the way it's evolved turns into systems that, give access to particular groups and deny access to others. And that I think this just sort of brings back to the intentionality piece.
Let me give a quick example. So the banking partner with that we work most closely with for our portfolio companies has given us some feedback. And what they've told us is that the second round of PPP did a much better job addressing the smaller guys and gals in business. What did they do? And consequently, did a much better job with minorities and the underserved populations. What did they do? They turned to 1099s as opposed to some of the financials that were required in the first round. What else did they do? People were able to apply for themselves. And something so simple as being able to stop and start in the application process was built into the system. And there were other things. They started using Social Security numbers instead of EINs, which a lot of sole proprietors didn't have EINs. Now, right. So there are now we've got really hard data on how much that can change and how it can drive the outcome that we want deeper to get the PPP resources, stabilizing resources to the companies that need them most.
Women receive much less venture capital funding than you would expect, certainly as a percentage of the population, but also probably as a percentage of even of high-tech entrepreneurs. There's been a lot of progress over the last few years, but if we look at the last year, we're actually now again seeing a widening of the gap with the number of, or the value of deals for businesses that are founded by women declining by 31%. So almost twice the decline seen overall in the terms of the number of startups.
Our friend Paul Gompers has a paper with several colleagues called, I guess, venture capital's Me Too moment. And we're seeing a lot of changes inside venture capital organizations in terms of their composition and how that's impacting, in terms of how that's impacting how they're investing.
You know, one of the interesting things about Paul's work, less about the Me Too hashtag, but putting that aside, one of the interesting things that Paul finds in that paper really is that, the Ellen Pao trial led to more hiring of female partners at venture firms, and that the investment in female-led businesses went up as a result. But the really interesting piece of it is that it did not go up for the male partners. It goes up, the investments are coming from female investors in female-led businesses. And I think there is, this is maybe just a start in the direction, but there is a discussion to be had here around if we want to see more investment in, minority-led startups, in female-led startups. Is part of that about having, and part of the reason we haven't seen it as much, the fact that we don't have as many investors that come from communities of color or that come from that come from other, the other gender, and, how much of this can we help accelerate by just sort of recognizing that, even if you sort of take bias out of the discussion, just the fact that sometimes, the types of businesses that women are leading, the types of businesses that underrepresented minorities are leading, are hitting target markets that your average male white investor just doesn't understand enough to really see the opportunities. And, will we see, with more of this movement towards bringing in partners into the investment partnerships that come from different backgrounds, will we now see that trickle over into investment into founders that come from different backgrounds?